Hollande speaking to France 24's Roselyne Fèvre, Radio France International's Jean-Karim Fall, and TV5's David Doulouse. With us to talk about that interview, Patrick Smith, Editor-in-Chief of the Africa Report. How are you, sir? Also with us, Jamie Keaton, journalist at the Associated Press, Sylvain Attal, France 24 new media editor, and the Africa editor at France 24, Ebba Kalando. Welcome to all of you. Jamie, an entire 30 minutes devoted to foreign policy. How'd the new French president do?
I think it did pretty well. I mean, obviously we have a lot of questions. France is in a position where it has cast its position pretty firmly on some of these issues, namely on Syria, namely on Mali. And both of them, in both cases, France is trying to go through the international organizations, notably the UN and the Security Council. Obviously, with Syria, it's been a little bit of a roadblock there for France in the sense that obviously the Russians and the Chinese have blocked two resolutions. So Francois Hollande is doing what he can, which is trying to use French diplomacy, which is always one of Paris's greatest assets. So we'll see what he's actually able to achieve. But it's so far he's striking. It seems to be striking the right tones.
You mentioned French diplomacy. Let's set the context of this. Patrick Smith, he is going to the summit of Francophone nations in Kinshasa. There were doubts at one point as to whether or not he would go. His argument for going is, I'm going to meet with everybody there. And the people told me it's better I go than I don't go.
Well, I wonder how many people told him it was better he went than didn't go, because certainly there are some NGOs here in Paris who strongly wanted him not to go. They're the NGOs that are very much pursuing the Bien Mal Acquis story, and they believe there are a lot of Bien Mal Acquis
ill-gotten gains,
indeed, attached to the current regime in Kinshasa, so they didn't want him to go. In fact, one NGO, as I understand it, actually initiated legal proceedings challenging Monsieur Hollande's presence in Kinshasa on the basis that La Francophonie has very clearly defined rules about where its summit should be held, and it should be held in countries that respect human rights and have a transparent system of justice which enables the natural resources of those countries to be properly used for the benefit of the citizens. And I think it takes quite a stretch of the imagination by the French presidency and the Quai d'Orsay to cast the government in Congo-Kinshasa as that sort of government. So that's a peculiar aberration, I think, to start with.
And Ebba Kalando, at one point, he says, it's the summit of French-speaking nations. I've got to be there.
Well, I think he's straddling really, he's between a rock and a hard place, really, whether he could go to Kinshasa or not. Being the capital where the largest French-speaking nation in the world,
that's right. There's more.
He'd be very hard-pressed. I think he's at pains to be able to acknowledge that fact, especially when France and the development of the French language, as you see when the Académie Française, which is sort of the trustees of the French language, as you will, for the past 20 years, you've been more and more people who are not from, people who are not born in Europe, but actually, enriching the French language from their own experience. So I think it was very difficult for him not to go on that basis.
He seemed to be awfully grateful that all these people in Africa are speaking French. Yeah, it was like a bit of a throwback to Charles de Gaulle, I thought. Thank you so much for speaking French. In fact, French is now an African language, which I thought was a clever piece of diplomacy.
Yeah. And especially also because of this argument where you have Francophone African-speaking countries like Gabon, who now wants to try and have a bilingual system, have French and English like Rwanda has. And this very peculiar race of who speaks English and who speaks French in Africa has always been a very peculiar part of France's idea of how important it is on the continent.
And one that sometimes triggers envy. The French are able to bring to those summits countries that don't even speak French at all, like Egypt, like Zimbabwe. And sometimes people say, how do the French do it?
I think he's absolutely right to go to the summit because the empty share policy is not a policy for France. And he wants to have an African policy. a new African policy. And I think that there's a real change when he said, but it's also a bet. I mean, he's going to have kind of a hard time in Kinshasa because he's going to meet with Tshisekedi, and he
Head of the
intends,
opposition.
apparently he intends to have a truth, tell the truth to the people of Congo, of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's kind of new for a French president. And it's a policy, for example, that Mitterrand inaugurated, for example, with the Palestinians and the Israelis, telling everyone the same thing, that you have to be a good Democrat, etc. It's going to be very hard for him. But I think it's a rupture with Sarkozy, clearly.
According to newspaper Le Figaro, it's only his second trip to Africa, and the first time was when he was a graduate student.
Yes, and he's been very frank about this, and this is also part of what he wants to emphasize, is that Africa is going to be just another part of the world, and basically we are going to be able to talk on things that like mutual values of human rights, of due process, of good governance and security. And I think he really wants to, like he said in the interview, that he'd really rather prefer that we don't use France and Africa in the same word, if at all possible. And I think it's important, it's true, because that perception has hamstrung any type of idea that he could practically get going within an Africa policy or a foreign policy from France, because it's not just the government and how it is that they want to break free from previous governments, but it's also the very political parties that make up the government that also have their relationships with
Everyone's got their pals.
with the political establishments on the continent.
But there's one strange thing, for example, when he says we don't want to have the diplomacy of our economic interest. Of course, we want to have everyone wants to have the diplomacy of their economic interest.
And
The problem
Jamie King,
that was not the problem with France Afrique. I want to recall the problem with France Afrique was the kind of murky deals with the African presidents, for financing political parties, etc. That was the problem.
Jamie Keaton, at one point, Jean-Karim Fall of RFI asks him the question about the interests of French oil companies.
Yes.
And
France obviously has particularly Total, which he was talking about. France does have pretty significant economic interest in Africa. And let's just take a step back. I mean, they mentioned this during the interview, but what's really important is that France, from the get-go, under Francois Hollande, has been looking to cast this new image of diplomatie économique, economic diplomacy. You have to understand that Francois Hollande, for weeks, if not months, has been almost every element of his international policy has had to do with economics, whether it be Europe, his major crisis. He's thinking about saving money and generating more money for French businesses.
And he's absolutely right.
And Africa happens to be, as they said in that interview, Africa happens to be one of the few major areas in the world which is growing right now, and France is trying to use its historical ties.
Patrick Smith, when he said that Africa does 20% of its business with France, is that accurate?
It sounds like in the heydays that was certainly accurate. I just wonder. I mean, China now accounts for China alone, not the rest of Asia, just China accounts for over 50% of public works contracts in Africa. China is now doing more business alone with Africa in terms of trade and investment than the United States, and it's coming up fast behind the entire European Union. So I wonder if that's not a bit of an overestimate. Just on the sort of secret deals with the oil stuff, I don't think. The environment has changed since Francois-Afrique. It's very difficult for him to do that sort of policy now, I think. You've got the former head of ELF now facing trial in Togo. You've got a European Union Commission about to implement the same Dodd-Frank's rules that you have in the States about illegal payments from oil companies to officials across the developing world. So I think the whole arena for those sort of secret, corrupt deals is just getting narrower, and it sort of suits the Parti Socialiste because that's their sort of avowed policy, let's abjure corruption. So it's a bit convenient, and he's
how much of that is a reflection of Africa's own internal reforms more so than France's?
I think it fits in with with a new agenda of a younger generation of reform-minded people in Africa who are just saying, stop stealing the money, Mr. Western oil company, and Mr. President, we know you're in an alliance together. You've robbed our country, you've robbed our continent. We want to change it, and I think that's the mood.
Very clever in bringing that up by saying that part of his policy for Africa right now is to be able to engage with a much younger African demography, which is very savvy politically and wants to get into the political process and political participation.
Uses the internet, so
absolutely.
And he says, well, you can't say one thing in Paris and say the other thing in Bamako or Dakar. The reason you can't do that is now because everyone in Dakar and Bamako is on the internet and checking you out.
Exactly.
So they know.
But I think that
François
Hollande is generally in line with that, is an understanding with this new generation in Africa. I think he really wants to cut with these things of the past, with the France-Afrique, etc.
But at the same time, I think France is to play catch-up so quickly, and it's almost, sometimes a bit of it is a little too little too late, really. China, for example, and the way that the African states have reacted to the Chinese engagement with the continent, especially by having the biggest capital projects on the continent, is that there are the rules that France is not privy to anymore. As to African leaders have also started to change their stance towards Western donors. They were like, well, actually, we'll think about that. I'm not quite sure whether I'll sign it.
So why being shameful for pushing our economic interests?
No. I'm not saying that. I think he's got to push France's economic interest in vastly different political and ideological environments right now in Africa that have already been changed by other players like China and this new generation that Patrick was talking about from the political participation point of view.
By the way, before he reaches Kinshasa, Francois Hollande will land in Dakar Friday for a speech before Parliament. Senegal, where powers recently changed hands through the ballot box. That isn't always the case on the African continent. And where the last time a French president came to give a speech, it left a bit of a bitter taste.
The tragedy of Africa is that the African man has not participated enough in the making of history. The African farmer whose life has followed the rhythm of the seasons for thousands of years and whose ideal is to live in harmony with nature only knows the eternal repetition of time made up of the endless reappearance of the same gestures and the same words.
You mentioned the internet, Patrick Smith. That one's sure done the rounds.
It's inspired several academic treatises in Senegal itself, and a lot of pretty virulent reaction on the internet. Yeah, I think there was one. I mean, he started off with this great idea to publicize the great rupture with Francois, and then he made that speech, and I think it was over the same day, more or less. I mean, I think then
I think what it also exposes is the absolute cynicism of the Sarkozy regime when it thought about its dealings with Africa. Nobody within the Sarkozy entourage thought that maybe if you're going to go to Africa and then be this contemptuous and paternalistic, that maybe you might want to turn it down a bit.
When France 24 Roselyne Fèvre asked him, are you doing this to needle Sarkozy? Are you doing this to play catch up after what happened the last time? He denied it. But do you agree with that?
You don't shoot to an ambulance. I mean, this speech by Sarkozy was totally contradicted by the fact. And when you see, for example, the democratic process in Senegal that happens in the last elections, for example, it's totally a contradiction to what said Sarkozy 5 years ago. So he doesn't even have to say, I'm going to be the anti-Sarkozy in Dakar. It's going to be just François Hollande. And when you think that the guy who wrote this speech was earning 40,000 euro a month, my God, that's just...
They should get their money back.
Now, according to Senegalese portal Seneweb, Hollande met Monday with African scholars who helped him with that speech that you're going to be hearing on Friday, most notably urging him to take a look at Obama's speech, at Barack Obama's speech when he went to Accra. Jamie Keaton, did you already, when we were talking a moment ago about the youth and vibrancy of Africa, did you already get a sense that there was that sort of little whiff of Obama in there somewhere?
Well, obviously, he would be playing to try to score political points because obviously Obama is a very popular person here in France. Who knows? I mean, it's a tough act to follow if you're going to try to compare him to Obama when it comes to that.
Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, it's true that he kept on repeating words like hope and continent of the future, and engaging the younger population in the political process and involving them as legitimate demographic to be able to be spoken to, speaking to the opposition, but also recognizing the government. It's all very peace and love. But
I thought the whole policy, actually, I mean, Obama-esque was the
Very much
sort of
so.
adjective that came to my mind.
Yes.
When he laid out the whole policy, didn't quite say leading from behind, but it wasn't we're going to steam into Mali and kick out the terrorists. It's we're going to work with our African partners and we're going to get a consensus and we're going to help as much as we can. We're not going to put boots on the ground. It's very much like sort of Obama in Libya. Let's see what happens and we get a coalition together. We'll deal with this.
The thing is that there's the same kind of soft-spoken guy like Obama, but he hardly has the same charisma.
Yeah, there is a difference.
Charisma is not everything. No, but charisma is not everything. Look at Obama 4 years after. If you look at the results, it's not very convincing. And you can say maybe, paradoxically, Hollande can have better results. We don't know. But right now we can just say, well, he has progress to be made in terms of, politics is the art of talking to people, and it's we're going to wait. This speech is going to be very important.
He comes across as honest.
Patrick Smith, you mentioned Mali, and in the interview that we just listened to, he mentioned that there'd be logistics, equipment, training, no boots on the ground. When there was a question asked about air support, there he sort of dodged around it, and we know that the United States is considering drones.
Considering it's implemented, let's be honest. I mean, there's enough reporting on the ground from our friends that are out there, and this isn't something new. That whole strip of the Sahel has been a war zone for the last 5 years. ACME are operating there, but a range of groups, and the Algerians are there. Special air services from America and from the French have been in southern Algeria operating, going across the border. I mean, none of that is new. So I think he's not going to sort of get into the gory details of that. I thought one thing was incredibly disingenuous, I have to say. This issue of Qatar. Qatar is monitoring where it sends its weapons. Qatar is monitoring where it sends its weapons, and it will send them to wherever helps Qatar's interests. Qatar armed the Islamist brigades in Libya and didn't give a damn when those arms, many of them, ended up across the border supporting Islamist insurrection in northern Mali. That is the truth. And I think it would behoves all of us to say that a bit more clearly.
So you mean that we have to arm the good guys?
I think we have to watch who we arm. I mean, what happened in Libya was that Qatar had an autonomous policy of arming its favoured people where there was no responsibility, and it armed some of the characters who have carried out these attacks against Libyan civilians. They've smashed up historic monuments in Libya and killed quite a lot of civilians. I'm not talking just about the Americans, but actually a lot of secular Libyans.
Well, I don't think it's just Qatar who was
but they certainly led the
Libyans.
charge.
But clearly what Hollande was saying is that there's a bit of a Libyan hangover. As to, everybody went in gung-ho and there was a very moralistic tone of we've got to arm, we've got to do something now, not wait tomorrow. And clearly Mali is going to, is suffering or has to live with the consequences of that.
He's not condemning the fact that we went to Libya in order to get rid of Gaddafi. There's always a price to pay. See what I mean?
Yes, absolutely.
That's the problem with Hollande when he says, for example, no boots on the ground, no intervention of French soldiers.
But he does say that he's smarting. He said at the end of the interview, he's smarting when you see when you provide weapons, and he said Libya. That you don't know where those weapons go.
Was it wrong to go to Libya?
It was a lesson learned.
Was it wrong to go to Libya? That's the real question. Was it wrong to go to Libya? Of course not. No one's going to say that it was wrong to go to Libya.
Remember,
there's always a price to pay.
Remember, in the case of Libya, of course, is that France at one point airdropped weapons into the Jebel Nafousa in the western part of Libya. And some people argued that was it was a debate in the United Nations as to whether or not France had actually violated.
And on Mali, everyone knows that nothing's going to happen in Mali only with the Africans. Nothing can be done without
Well,
support.
it's going to be a long process, whatever happens.
Whatever
I mean, you
happens,
have to
yeah.
look at the situation. I mean, France recently, just this week, has floated a UN Security Council resolution that's a draft resolution, and the French diplomats themselves say that it's going to take some time, several weeks at least, until the first round, which is just to sort of lay the groundwork for potential military intervention.
I thought he missed a bit of a trick when he didn't talk about the pretty brave people in Timbuktu and
Right.
Gao and these places where they're organizing daily demonstrations against these guys that are trying to take over their areas and boss them around and shoot them in the head and chop their arms off. These are often women are running these demonstrations, and I thought maybe he could have actually sort of talked that up.
Do you think they're
Because-
asking for African troops? Of course not. They know that the African troops alone cannot do anything for them. They're asking for international support. They're asking for French, for American support, because they know that the African troops. Do we have an example in the past that African troops were able
Yes.
to?
Well, you
Sudan.
do actually.
Sudan, the Ethiopian.
Darfur.
That's.
No, it's not. The
Well,
army's true.
I mean,
No,
it
no,
took
I
a long
think there's-
time. Sierra Leone,
No,
Liberia.
I think there's enough. There's enough historical material to be able to prove that point. But you must also remember that those African troops also work within a framework of the international community that then decides how and where they can go.
What's going on in Somalia? I mean,
yes,
it's the same
exactly.
story.
Yeah.
I mean,
You know,
it may be a mess, but it's
Absolutely.
going to be a mess, quite frankly. It's going to be a mess if a lot of white troops run around
Absolutely.
there
Mhm.
as
And
well,
they
because
will
they're going to
never
get
go
picked
back.
off very quickly.
And
So we
not
have to
just
find
that.
more Ethiopian troops to go to now.
And also,
Mostly are Ugandan. The vast majority are
Eva
Ugandan.
Kalando,
Yeah.
Patrick Smith saying that perhaps President Hollande missed a trick when he didn't salute the brave people of Timbuktu. How did he handle when there was the question about Algeria? He's going to Algeria on December the 5th, and the previous foreign minister under Nicolas Sarkozy, quite outspoken in saying that the Algerians had not stepped up to the plate when it came to the situation in northern Mali. How do you think Francois Hollande handled it in this interview?
I thought he handled it quite cleverly in saying that, I've got no lessons to give to Algeria that has such a massive experience of dealing with fundamental politics. But he also quite cleverly said that, they know the danger, so there's absolutely nothing I can tell them. So it's sort of, he's good copying, bad copying at the same time. But clearly he wants Algeria to be part of this process. And without Algeria, really, not much can be
But
achieved.
it's
really.
a difficult job. I mean, who's going to stitch this together? Because you've got the
This is
ECOWAS
true.
people that have one agenda, very
is
clearly
true.
sort of the West African, underneath the Sahara, and then you've got Algeria and Mauritania with quite different agendas,
Totally.
and rather perhaps a little sort of overconfident of these are our people.
And
ACME
then-
is
yeah.
basically an Algerian organization reflagged, so we know what to do
Exactly.
here.
And a
Let's-
border
let's-
area twice the
yeah,
size of
let's
France
keep-
that has to be patrolled by somebody.
and we're the force there. So, I mean, I think who knows what France is going to do, but it's probably going to play quite a pivotal role in just keeping everybody singing from the same hymn sheet.
Absolutely.
Jamie Keaton, at one point, there was the question put to him about the 6 French hostages that are being held in the Sahara Desert. And he answered with a rhetorical question. Do you think that French policy can be dependent on a hostage situation?
Yeah, that was a really interesting. Obviously, you talk about being a rock in a hard place. This is a very difficult one for Francois Hollande. He's obviously very
Because it would
concerned
spell death for those 6 hostages?
potentially
If there was a French
And
intervention.
France is already. I mean, as we remember, there was an incident where some French people were taken from a cafe, as I remember, in
Niger's capital.
in Niger and Niamey, and was and were killed. Pretty quickly after. So there's obviously the fallout from that in terms of what it would mean for public opinion in France. I don't think there's any safe sort of alternative really for Hollande in this. I don't know. Would you guys agree with that?
No, I totally agree. He was quite courageous to say that, but on the other hand, it's the only thing he can say. And it's strange because he's saying we're going to support the intervention in Mali, and we will do everything to free the hostages. What does it mean? Everything? Are we going to?
But he tried to temper it
Yeah,
a little bit by saying that
that's
trying to
Hollande,
free the
that's-
hostages and help liberate Mali is not mutually
That's exactly.
Yeah.
Hollande is always like
ideas.
that. Balance every time. Balance, and you cannot. At the end, you don't know what
One
he
has to
wants.
trump the other.
He didn't
yes.
do the Thatcher thing, which was to say Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister, said, we will never pay ransoms, which they said, okay, now we get it, and that's, I think there was obviously a lot of back channel stuff going on, and he didn't want to disrupt
One thing that was
it.
really striking, actually, I think what he said, I mean, according to the translation, but said that he thought that the efforts to sort of rectify the situation in northern Mali may put them in a mindset to release the hostages, which I found very contradictory. I don't know how he thought that was going to work
Probably
together.
the signal that there's some back channel negotiations. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but
I don't
much
know.
of the back channel negotiations is being directed from Niger or
And
Burkina
Hollande
Faso.
seemed to be conveying this image that they are trying to read between the lines as to what the communications are with ACME. I mean, that they're
Pretty clear.
Final point before we go, and that's on Syria and the helplessness of the international community. And again, we talked about providing weapons earlier in our discussion. Francois Hollande saying that it's not for providing a lot of weapons is not the answer. You're talking about being balanced there. If it was, he was quite clear on that point.
And also clear on the safe zones, etc., humanitarian help. It's sort of beginning to sort of join up a bit, because there is a sort of a crisis of conscience in the West. What are we going to do? It's like, this is the Spanish Civil War of our age. These people are getting wiped out, and we're just standing around agonizing. We can't handle this. We can't do it. So I think that was interesting. I also thought it was quite interesting that France traditionally has got a lot more leverage with Russia than most of the rest of the Western countries. The fact that he was trying to reason out with Putin, I think that was quite significant. The sooner this changes, the better you'll be. If you stretch it out, the message is Assad's going to lose eventually. The longer it's stretched out, the worse it's going to be for you in the end. So why not support a quick change?
That was kind of an interesting position, actually, because the argument that Putin has been making about Syria is, watch out, it may become Libya, where you have a situation where there are weapons all over the place and there's instability. And Hollande seems to be trying to address that very issue.
And it's an issue that we're going to continue to follow. I want to thank you, Jamie Keaton, Ebba Colando, Patrick Smith, and Sylvain Attal. And thank you for joining us here in this special edition following François Hollande's interview to France 24. And if you missed parts of our France 24 RFI TV5 interview with François Hollande, you can join us at midnight or 3 a.m. Paris time, 1 hour earlier if you're in the UK, 6 or 9 p.m. Eastern. Laura Baines has all the news at the top of the hour. You're watching France 24. And on the net, may I say, on France24.com. Stay with us.